I wasn't supposed to see it. The folder, beige and tucked under a pile of outdated bank statements, hadn't been touched in years, maybe longer. But the second I read the label, estate plan, last will, testament, my hand froze. Something deep in my chest went quiet. It was a chilly Wednesday in March. My father had called me 2 nights earlier, complaining about a headache and asking if I could help with the refinancing paperwork. He said he didn't understand half of what they were asking for, said it made his temples throb just looking at the forms. I told him I'd come by after work. Of course I did. I always did. I found myself at the kitchen table again, like I had so many times before, organizing the mess of envelopes, past due notices, old tax returns, and whatever else had accumulated since my last visit. Dad was napping in the living room, the television murmuring nonsense. I worked quietly. It was a rhythm I knew too well. Stack, sort, toss, keep. Nothing unusual until that folder. I shouldn't have opened it. Technically, it wasn't part of the task. But after 5 years of covering mortgage payments, repairs, insurance, groceries, and every little emergency Kaylee threw our way, I figured I had the right to know what I was helping to keep afloat. I expected to see Dad's name, maybe even Werner's. But what I saw made the floor feel like it shifted. Kaylee Jordan Winslow. Again and again. She wasn't just mentioned, she was everything. The house, the accounts, the car, the insurance. Every single asset went to her, and me. There was a single line near the end. We love both of our daughters. That was it, nothing else. No acknowledgement, no percentage, not even a backup clause. My name, the one I'd signed on 5 years of online transfers, checks, and emergency Zelle payments, wasn't there, not once. I sat back in the chair, the wooden frame creaking under my weight. My hands weren't shaking, but they felt cold, detached. My jaw locked, eyes skimming the pages again, searching for some footnote, some mention, anything. But it was all clean, deliberate. I heard the recliner in the next room shift. My dad's footsteps followed, slow and tired. "You done yet?" he asked from the doorway, rubbing the side of his head like the air itself caused his headache. I didn't look up right away. I just held up the folder. "This what you wanted help with?" His face twisted, just slightly. It's not what it looks like." "No?" I flipped the folder open. "Everything goes to Kaylee." "It's more complicated than that," he said, not meeting my eyes. I nodded, too calm. "So explain it." He sighed. "You've always been strong. Kaylee, she's different." "I noticed," I said, sharp but steady. "Different enough to get everything." There was a long pause. He looked at the floor. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered. "That sentence, you wouldn't understand. It hit harder than the folder." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just stood up, placed the folder neatly on the pile, and walked out of the kitchen. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't eat. I sat in the dark with a glass of wine and opened my laptop. I hadn't planned on digging, but that folder had lodged itself behind my ribs. I logged into my online banking and pulled up every mortgage payment. I'd paid the exact same amount for 60 months. I checked where the payments went. Werner's account, I kept scrolling. Roof replacement in 2020. I'd wired $11,400 new appliances, covered. Groceries. When Kaylee had car trouble, that too. Then I opened the county property records. The house had been legally transferred to Kaylee last year. It was no longer theirs to leave me. It was already hers. I sat there, stone still. Then I checked Facebook. I don't know why I did it. Muscle memory maybe. But the first thing that loaded was a photo of Kaylee on the front porch, sipping coffee from a mug I bought Mom years ago. Dad sat behind her, smiling. The caption read, "Grateful to care for the home that shaped me. Always family first." The comments were worse. "You're amazing for taking care of them." "Some people run when it gets hard, not you." "You're the glue, Kaylee. Keep holding it together." I kept scrolling. Then I saw Werner's comment. She's always been our rock, some daughters just take. My chest burned. Kaylee's life, the one I'd quietly subsidized for years, was being polished into a hero's tale. I closed the app, then I opened a new folder on my desktop. Legal, personal into it, I dropped every PDF, every bank statement, every record I had, and then a second folder. Media strategy. This wasn't rage, this was clarity. They'd erased me. I was going to write myself back in with receipts. By the time the eviction notice was in my hands, the room felt colder than it was. I looked at the stamped date. It had been filed 2 days after I sent them the email outlining everything: payments, proof, the will, the receipts. They didn't respond. They just signed a form. I turned to my father, but he was already looking away, pretending the carpet was worth his full attention. Verna stood by the hallway, arms crossed, her voice coated in something close to disdain. "It's for the best, Wendy. Your energy isn't good for this house." My energy. That's what they'd decided to call years of sacrifice. "You handed me an eviction notice because I asked to be acknowledged," I asked. "Because I brought proof of what I've done." "You threatened legal action," Verna said, lifting her chin slightly. "I stated facts," I said. "You all just didn't like what they showed." Dad sighed. "This doesn't have to be ugly." It already was. No one offered to help me pack. The boxes were already stacked by the door, my name scrawled on each in rushed marker, like they couldn't wait to get me out, like I was just clutter now. I made 3 trips to the car. Nobody spoke. Nobody stopped me. On my final trip out, Kaylee stood at the end of the hallway, sipping something from a monogrammed mug. Her sweatshirt had the house's zip code printed across the chest. One of those Etsy-style, home is where the heart is things. I hated how easy she made it all look. "Leaving already?" she asked, voice light. "Didn't think you'd fold that fast." I met her eyes. "You might have stolen the deed," I said, "but you'll never own what built this place." She laughed, short and sharp. "What? Your spreadsheets? Your pity payments? Grow up." I didn't respond, just picked up the last box and walked out. Snow had started to fall, thin, slow flakes spiraling through the March air like they didn't care where they landed. That night, I reopened the folder labeled Reclaim. I added a subfolder, Eviction. Inside, I dropped photos of the notice, time-stamped screenshots of the stacked boxes, and a voice memo. March 3rd. Wendy Taylor, evicted by family from primary residence. All belongings boxed before arrival, no conversation permitted. Notice signed by Kaylee Winslow and Wendell Taylor. I paused, then added, "They crossed every line. Now I'll redraw the map." The next morning, my neighbor, Mrs. Harlan, knocked on my door. She didn't say much, just handed me a USB drive and said, "You should have this." It was footage from her door camera. Verna, in her powder pink coat, had taken the bouquet I left on the porch beneath the memorial plaque for my mother and tossed it in the garbage without hesitation. No pause, no hesitation, just discarded and walked back inside. There was no audio, but I didn't need it. I added the footage to the folder, renamed the file, "Guess You Weren't Supposed to See This." Later that day, my phone buzzed with a news notification. Local feature: Daughter abandons aging father amid estate dispute. They'd gone public. The article included a photo of me dragging a suitcase out of the house, captured from some angle that made me look cold, even heartless. The write-up quoted Verna. "It's been heartbreaking to see how bitter Wendy has become. Her father is devastated." Kaylee added, "I've done everything to keep this family together." She walked out. No mention of the eviction notice, no mention of the payments, just a fabricated story with all the sympathy neatly wrapped around them. I didn't scream, I didn't even clench my fists. I just opened a new email to mayareadtruthlines.org. Subject: Correction Request, Estate Fraud. Story body: Dear Ms. Reed, I am the individual referenced in the recent Tacoma local feature. Attached are documents, video evidence, and financial records that contradict the published narrative. I am willing to speak if needed, but I believe the facts are strong enough on their own. Sincerely, Wendy Taylor. Attachments: mortgage utility receipts, legal will, eviction notice, surveillance footage. I hit send. Her response came in less than an hour. Got it. Reviewing. The footage is eye-opening. Can I call you tomorrow morning for a statement? I replied, absolutely. That night, I didn't open social media. I didn't scroll. I didn't chase comments or try to fix public perception. I knew better now. They told the world a story. I submitted the truth. The next morning, as the sky began to pale, my phone lit up again. Truth lines: feature confirmed, story pending verification. No fanfare, no drama, just forward motion. They started the storm, but I'd already built the shelter. With facts, with evidence, with years of showing up, they could spin their narrative. I had reality on my side, and the truth, when you give it room, it echoes louder than any lie. The courthouse was quiet, in a way that didn't feel calm. It felt loaded, like the walls were waiting to hear something that had been held back too long. I met Claire, my attorney, just before the hearing. She didn't waste words. We shook hands, and she handed me the binder, not heavy in weight, but packed with 5 years of proof. Receipts, screenshots, the notarized will, the video of Werner tossing away my mother's flowers. Nothing in it was loud, but everything in it was final. In the courtroom, Kaylee sat on the right, flanked by Werner and my father. She looked like someone who thought she'd already won. Werner had her signature performance expression on, wounded, weary, misunderstood. My father just sat still, gaze fixed on nothing in particular, like if he stayed quiet long enough, it would all go away. It wouldn't. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Morton, didn't bother with small talk. Once we were seated, she motioned to Claire. Proceed. Claire stood with the kind of confidence that doesn't ask permission. Your Honour, this is not a case of confusion or miscommunication. This is a case of deliberate concealment of a valid will, suppression of inheritance, and financial exploitation. She held up the binder and placed copies on the clerk's desk. My client, Wendy Taylor, paid for this house's mortgage for 5 consecutive years. She covered maintenance, taxes, insurance, and emergency expenses, all verifiable. She was also the named heir in her late mother's updated will. A document signed, notarized, and now submitted for your review. The judge didn't react, just nodded once and began flipping through the first set of documents. Claire continued. What did the other parties do in response to her contributions? They transferred the deed of the home to Ms. Taylor's stepsister without informing her. They filed a legal eviction notice after she requested a conversation. They publicly discredited her, and they buried the original will. She paused. Then she added, We've included footage from a neighbour's camera showing Werner Winslow disposing of a memorial left by the deceased. This demonstrates intent, not oversight, not confusion, intent. The judge looked up for the first time. Her gaze didn't flicker. Counsel for the respondents. Werner's lawyer, a man in an oversized blazer who looked like he hadn't read a thing before today, stood and cleared his throat. There may have been misunderstandings. The family was under emotional stress, no harm was intended, and the transfer of ownership was meant to reflect practical concerns. Kaylee Winslow has been present in the home. She's assisted with caregiving. The family dynamic is complicated. Is there any documentation of Kaylee Winslow's financial contributions? Judge Morton asked, eyes fixed on him. He shifted. We do not have those records at this time. Any proof of shared ownership agreements, contracts, power of attorney assignments? No, Your Honour. She turned to Kaylee. Did you contribute financially to the maintenance or mortgage of the home? Kaylee sat up straighter. I helped around the house. I cleaned. I supported them emotionally. Judge Morton's voice didn't rise. That's not a legal contribution. Emotional support, while meaningful, does not establish property rights. She turned to my father. "Mr. Taylor, were you aware of the updated will?" He hesitated. Claire opened the folder, handed over the letter my mother had written 6 days before her death. Judge Morton read it silently. Then she looked at him again. "Were you aware?" He nodded once, barely. "And you chose not to submit it to the court after her passing?" He didn't answer. "That's all I need." She closed the file. "This court finds in favor of Wendy Taylor. The property in question will be transferred to her name in full. The will, dated and notarized, is legally binding. Miss Taylor is the sole heir and executor of the estate." Verna whispered something to Kaylee. Kaylee's jaw clenched. My father stared at the table like it might speak up and defend him, but there was nothing left to say. Outside the courtroom, Claire turned to me. "You won't get an apology." "I don't need one," I said. "We didn't shake hands this time." She nodded once and walked toward the parking lot. I stood alone for a while. The building behind me was made of concrete and steel, but it wasn't what felt solid. What felt solid was everything I had carried into that room. The facts, the documents, the silence I'd held for years, and the decision to break it. The next morning, I printed 3 letters, one for each of them: Verna Winslow, Kaylee Winslow, Wendell Taylor. Each one included a 30-day notice, pack vacate, legally enforced. I didn't watch them read them. I didn't hover near the mailbox or check the cameras. I gave them the dignity of silence, something they never gave me. 2 weeks later, Kaylee left first. Her car pulled out at sunrise. No words, no post, just silence. Verna followed 3 days later, a rented moving van and a door that closed without a backward glance. Wendell lingered. The deadline passed. 3 more days. I found him in the garage staring at an old tackle box. "You used to fish with me," he said. "I did." He paused. "You always brought that trail mix without raisins. You always said raisins ruined it." A long silence passed. I never wanted it to end like this. "It didn't have to," I said. That night, he left too. I stood at the door for a long time after his truck disappeared down the street. The house was mine, legally. But more than that, the silence finally made sense. It wasn't empty anymore. It was honest. The house didn't feel like mine the morning after Wendell left. It felt still. Not quiet in a way that made you tense up, waiting for the next demand or sideways comment, just still, like the air was holding its breath. I stood in the center of the living room, the echo of my own footsteps following me as I walked room to room, not to inspect, but to absorb. There was no celebration, no moment of cinematic satisfaction, just the realization that the storm was finally over, and I was the only one left standing in it. I opened every window. The air outside was cold, sharp. It rushed in fast, circling corners that hadn't felt fresh in years. I let it move through the house uninterrupted, like it had its own work to do. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to defend my space. I didn't feel like I had to explain why I belonged here. I did. That was it. No further argument. By the end of the week, I'd done more than open windows. I cleared out every drawer labeled in someone else's handwriting. I boxed what wasn't mine and donated what no one claimed. I found photos I hadn't seen in years. Some of me and Mom at the lake, some of birthdays where I was in the background, arms full of plates while Kaylee smiled in front of the cake. I didn't throw them away. I didn't need to. This wasn't about erasing the past. It was about no longer letting it overwrite the truth. I repainted the hallway. Verna had chosen a dusty pink years ago, something she called soft and inviting. I covered it with a slate grey that reminded me of rainy mornings, the kind where you got work done because no one expected small talk. That was the first change. Next, I pulled out the notebook I'd left in a drawer years ago, the one I used to write ideas in, back when I had time to imagine something for myself. On the cover, I'd scribbled "Someday Plans." Most pages were blank, but a few had scattered notes, property management training, small rental unit idea, basement conversion, resource program for single moms, safe transition housing. I reread those pages more than once. Then I picked up a pen and kept going. By April, I'd enrolled in an online real estate licensing course. I passed the first 2 modules faster than I expected. The content wasn't foreign to me. I'd been handling paperwork, contracts, insurance, and taxes for years. I just hadn't done it for myself before. Now I was. I turned the basement into a project. A real one. I drew up plans, priced materials, watched more tutorials than I could count. My goal wasn't profit, it was purpose. I wanted to create something stable, quiet, and safe for someone who needed it. A mother starting over, a student with no fallback plan, someone like me 5 years ago. I worked late most nights, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. It felt new and familiar at once, like I was rebuilding not just a space, but myself, one layer at a time. I didn't hear from Verna or Kaylee. I didn't expect to. Wendell sent a single card in May, no return address. Inside, it just said, "You were always the strong one. I'm sorry it took me too long to see it." I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because I didn't want to open the door again just to watch him walk out a second time. Strength, I learned, wasn't about holding everything together. It wasn't about being quiet or easy or low maintenance. It was about knowing when enough is enough, when your silence stops being dignity and becomes complicity. I wasn't complicit anymore. In June, I opened the email that made everything feel real. A podcast producer had read Maya Reed's article and wanted to feature my story in a new series about financial abuse and family betrayal. I hesitated, then I wrote back, "Only if we focus on the solution, not just the hurt." She agreed. We recorded in July. I told the truth, not the tabloid version, not the Facebook version, the version that lives in between the headlines. The long years of quiet support, the assumptions made because I didn't complain, the way people confuse loyalty with invisibility. The story didn't need drama, it had weight without it. The episode aired 2 weeks later. I didn't post it anywhere, I didn't tell anyone in the neighborhood, but somehow the messages came in anyway, from strangers, from women I'd never met, from people who said, "That was me." I saved every message in a folder titled Visible. That fall, I finished the basement unit. I gave the first lease to a woman named Shay, a young mother with a toddler and no family nearby. She paid what she could. I covered the rest with a small grant I applied for under a non-profit initiative I created, Second Key Project. It wasn't big, but it was mine. In October, I stood on the back porch with a cup of tea. The garden beds were still empty, but I'd already started composting. The soil needed time. It had been stripped and neglected, but it could recover. It could grow again. So could I. This house would never be what it was before, and that was okay, because now, finally, it was what it was always meant to be. Mine, not out of ownership, not out of revenge, but out of truth. And the truth is quiet, but it never stays buried. 3 months passed before I heard her name again. It came up in a casual conversation at the co-op downtown. I was picking up donated tiles for the next basement project when a woman behind me in line glanced at my clipboard and said, "You know Kaylee Winslow, right?" I didn't flinch. We used to be connected. "Why?" She hesitated, then shrugged. She applied to volunteer here, said she had experience managing property and helping at-risk families. We ran a quick check. Things didn't match. I nodded. Nothing about Kaylee ever really did. I thanked her, paid for the tiles, and walked out without another word. That kind of exchange used to sting. Now it felt distant, like reading a story that used to feel personal, but now just read like fiction. Later that night, I opened the Reclaim folder on my laptop again, not to add anything, but to look. Every document, every receipt, every screenshot was still in place. I hadn't touched it in weeks, the folder didn't need updating anymore, it had done its job. I thought that would bring closure, and maybe in some ways it did. But closure isn't as clean as people think. It doesn't show up like a sealed envelope or a slammed door. Sometimes it looks like an old voicemail you forgot to delete, one line you didn't expect to still hurt. Werner's last words, "Bitterness doesn't entitle you to anything," had faded from memory for a while. But they returned one night while I was editing the application packet for the non-profit. That sentence had haunted me once. Now it rang hollow. Bitterness hadn't driven me, but clarity had, and the difference mattered. In late November, a letter arrived. No return address again, but I knew the handwriting. Wendell. Inside, one page. "I'm staying with your aunt in Portland. I'm not doing well, but I'm trying. I've thought about writing before, but I figured you'd already made your decision. I respect it. I do miss your mum, and sometimes I miss us too." I folded the letter and placed it in the back of the old recipe book Mum used to keep, the only place that still felt safe for unresolved things. The same week, I was invited to speak at a small community panel. Topic: Invisible Work, the Cost of Holding It All Together. I almost declined, but something in me, the part that had stayed silent for too long, said yes. The room wasn't big, but it was full. Teachers, social workers. A few young women who sat close together, nodding through every story. I didn't tell them everything, just the parts that mattered. How easy it is to disappear in families when you're the one who always says yes. How silence becomes mistaken for contentment. How giving too much doesn't make you valuable, it just makes you convenient. Afterward, a woman with greying hair pulled me aside and said, "I thought it was just me." I told her, "That's how they keep us quiet." Her eyes welled up. Mine didn't. I had cried enough in private, now I was building in public. In December, Shay, the tenant in the basement unit, brought her son upstairs for hot cocoa. They stayed for an hour. We didn't talk about trauma or rebuilding. We watched cartoons and laughed at nothing. When they left, she hugged me and whispered, "This place saved us." She didn't know how much I needed to hear that. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the journal I hadn't touched in a while. I wrote one line. They left me out of the story, so I wrote my own. In early January, I received an unexpected package. No name, just a P.O. box from somewhere near Spokane. Inside was a book of essays and a note clipped to the cover. Page 47. I thought of you. The essay was titled, "Not Every Silence is Peace." It spoke about the weight of being the dependable one, how society rewards loudness but leans on the quiet. I reread it twice. Maybe Wendell sent it, maybe he didn't. It didn't matter. I was no longer building myself on speculation. What I knew was enough. I knew that my mother trusted me enough to put my name on the final copy of her life's work. I knew that my absence in their will wasn't an accident. It was a strategy, a calculated erasure that only worked until I stood up and said, "No, I was here." I knew that money paid bills, but documentation told stories, and I'd saved every detail like bricks, one by one, until they formed a foundation no one could knock down. And I knew, most of all, that forgiveness doesn't require contact. Sometimes it's just choosing not to carry it anymore. The last folder I made on my laptop was called Legacy, not because I had something to prove, but because I had something to protect. I printed one copy of the entire case, from the first payment to the final ruling, and locked it in the safe. Not out of paranoia, but for the next woman who might need it. Sometimes justice isn't dramatic, sometimes it's slow, methodical, quiet. Sometimes it's a folder no one expects you to open, but you do, and everything changes. By spring, people had stopped asking how I was doing, not because they stopped caring, but because I'd stopped needing to answer. I wasn't trying to survive anymore, I was trying to live. The first sign of change wasn't a grand moment, it was subtle. I found myself waking up without checking my phone immediately. No instinct to look for damage control, no expectation of more spin from Kaylee, or cold silence from Wendell. The anxiety that used to sit right beneath my skin had settled, not disappeared, but no longer steering the wheel. I took that as permission. By May, the second key project had its first 2 residents. Shay had gotten a part-time job and saved enough to move into her own place. The basement unit was cleaned, repaired, and made ready again. A social worker referred me to Lana, a woman in her early 40s who'd left an abusive marriage and needed somewhere to land with her teenage daughter. She arrived with 2 bags and too many apologies. I told her she didn't owe me any. "This place isn't a handout," I said. "It's a handoff from one woman who had to start over to another." She smiled with her mouth, but it would take time for her eyes to catch up. I understood. I didn't press. In between helping with the project and finishing my real estate license, I found time for something else: therapy. Not the kind where you sit in silence waiting for a breakthrough, but the practical kind. Boundaries, family systems, recovery from long-term emotional minimization. The language sounded clinical at first. Eventually, it became familiar. It explained things I used to assume were just part of who I was, like why I flinched at praise, why I apologized before asking for anything, why I believed strength meant never needing help. The counselor didn't offer solutions. She asked questions that made me rewrite my own definitions. And that was harder and more freeing than anything else. One afternoon after a session, I sat on the porch rereading a letter I'd written months earlier but never sent. It had no address, no envelope, just 3 words at the top. "In case I forget." It reminded me that winning in court hadn't meant closure, it had meant choice. I'd earned the right to decide what came next, and what came next couldn't be centered around them. Not Kaylee, not Verna, not Wendell. This wasn't their story anymore. I reached out to Maya Reid again, the journalist who'd run my story, not for another interview, but for advice. She connected me to a woman in Austin who was starting a resource hub for family estranged adults, a place for people navigating legal, emotional, and financial fallout from toxic dynamics. We talked for an hour. By the end, she asked me to consult on a toolkit for others in similar situations, a free resource with templates for documenting contributions, building legal timelines, and preparing for court without emotional collapse. It felt good to build something no one could twist. In June, I launched a small YouTube series called Proof of Presence. No dramatic music, no clickbait titles, just real stories, mine and others, told plainly. The first episode was called The Strong One is Still a Person. I filmed it alone on a folding chair in the backyard. I said what I needed to say. I paid, I showed up, I stayed. That doesn't make me less deserving. It makes the silence louder. The comments surprised me, not because they were positive, but because they were grateful. This gave me language for what happened to me. I thought it was just my family. I finally told my sister I'm not invisible anymore. I replied to everyone. By late summer, the nonprofit had formal backing from a local foundation. The project grew slowly, but with purpose. We added weekend workshops, budgeting, credit repair, legal literacy. I brought in a counselor once a month to talk about emotional labor and why unpaid help isn't free. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't go viral, but it mattered. I also stopped checking Kaylee's social media. That was its own kind of milestone. I didn't care whether she was still posting photos of the house. She could caption whatever she wanted. I had the deed, the files, the record, and, more than any of that, the clarity. Let her chase applause. I was chasing peace. Wendell never wrote again. That surprised me less than I thought it would. He was a man who avoided confrontation even when truth stood 3 feet in front of him with proof in hand. I no longer took that personally. That was his ceiling, not my shortcoming. One day in September, I visited Mum's gravesite, not for closure, just to tell her about the house, about the project, about how I'd found a way to turn everything they'd tried to erase into something that helped others feel seen. I didn't bring flowers. I brought one of the workshop flyers. I tucked it beneath the small memorial plaque and whispered, "I did what you asked. I remembered who I am." The wind picked up for a moment, not a sign, just a moment, but it was enough. Driving home, I felt something settle, not an ending, a shift. I wasn't rebuilding anymore, I was building forward, with my own blueprints. This wasn't the part where the credits rolled, this was the part where I finally got to live my life. Not as the background character, not as the financial safety net, not as the one who kept everything running quietly, but as the one who refused to be forgotten. I used to think freedom would feel like something loud, a door slamming shut behind me, a final word that echoed so hard it left no room for anyone else to speak. I imagined a single moment where everything would click into place and I'd know without a doubt that I was done looking back. But it didn't happen like that. Freedom wasn't a single event. It came slowly, quietly, through choices that felt small until I realized I was finally making them for myself. One of those choices came in the middle of a Tuesday. I was replying to emails for the second key project when I noticed a name I hadn't seen in years. Dana Holloway, my cousin, the one who'd stayed at my place during her college internship, who I'd cooked for, covered rent for, and later saw comment online about how some people just disappear when they're needed. She'd written 2 sentences. I saw the article Maya did. I didn't know the whole story, I'm sorry. There was no explanation, no excuses. I read the message twice, then closed my laptop. I didn't reply. That wasn't bitterness. It was self-preservation. Not every wound needs to be reopened just because someone finally notices it's bleeding. That evening, I took a long walk through my neighborhood. I passed the school Kaylee and I had both gone to. I remembered the time she locked herself in the nurse's office after flunking a math test. Verna pulled her out of class and took her for ice cream to calm her nerves. I had failed a science project the same week and was told, "You'll bounce back, you're practical like your dad." It used to sting, now it just explained things. By October, the nonprofit had gained enough traction to move out of the house and into a shared space downtown. I kept the basement unit active, but the bigger vision needed room to grow. A small staff joined, volunteers, women who had walked through similar stories and wanted to build something better from the aftermath. One afternoon, a woman named Elise stopped by after one of our events. She'd sat through the session quietly, hands folded in her lap. "I read your court story a year ago," she said. "I've been keeping receipts ever since." She showed me a folder on her phone, every payment, every email. She wasn't ready to confront her family yet, but she was getting ready. I just needed to see someone else do it first. That stayed with me. It reminded me why I'd ever told my story out loud, not to reclaim a house, to remind someone else they could reclaim their own voice. The only unexpected thing about the following months was how ordinary they became. I stopped needing to prove anything. I stopped keeping tabs on old family connections. I let the narrative they told die its own quiet death. The final letter I received from Wendell arrived that winter. It was short. "You were right. I should have done more. I hope you're happy. That's all that matters now." No return address, no request for contact, just acknowledgement. That's all I'd ever wanted, not validation, not applause, just a line that said, "We saw what you did, and we know it mattered." By January, I'd passed the real estate exam, not because I needed a new job, but because I'd promised myself I wouldn't let their version of the future limit mine. I framed the certificate and put it on the wall of the new office, not out of pride, but because it represented something solid. Not what they gave me, but what I earned, what I kept, what I built. One rainy morning, I walked through the now empty living room of the house. I hadn't planned to sell it, but I knew I was ready to move on. The space had served its purpose. I'd reclaimed what was mine. I'd made it a refuge, but I didn't need to stay. Before closing the door for the last time, I left one thing behind: a sealed envelope on the kitchen counter, addressed simply, "To the next person who lives here." Inside was a note: "This house survived a lot, so did I. If you're here because you need to start over, I hope this space helps you. Just remember, what you've done still matters, even when no one says it out loud." Then I locked the door and dropped off the keys. I didn't look back. There was no symbolic final glance, no dramatic pause. I had other things to build now. A year earlier, I would have said I lost everything: my place in the family, the people who raised me, my sense of security. Now I saw it differently. I hadn't lost anything. I'd cleared the space for something real. I was no longer someone's backup plan. I was my own foundation, my own legacy, my own name, no longer whispered behind doors or scribbled out of folders, just mine, and that was enough.